In the quiet town of Ravenswood, the old train station had been abandoned for decades, its tracks rusting away and its platforms overgrown with weeds. But every year on the anniversary of the station's closure, the locals whispered about a ghost train that appeared on the tracks. They said that anyone who boarded the train would never return. One cold October night, a group of teenagers decided to test the legend. Armed with flashlights and a camera, they snuck into the station. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, and an eerie silence hung in the air. As midnight approached, a distant whistle echoed through the darkness, followed by the rumble of a train approaching. To their shock, a gleaming black steam engine pulled into the station, its windows glowing with an unnatural light. The doors slid open, and a figure in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform stepped out. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow. Without a word, he gestured for them to board. Nervously, they climbed aboard. The interior of the train was immaculate, with plush red velvet seats and brass fixtures. The train began to move, the landscape outside the windows blurring into darkness. The teenagers tried to speak, but their voices seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. As the train hurtled through the night, the conductor moved down the aisle, punching their tickets. But as he passed each passenger, they noticed something horrifying. Each one of them began to age rapidly. Their hair turned white, their skin wrinkled, and their bones grew brittle. Panic set in as they realized the train wasn't taking them to any ordinary destination. The conductor's hollow eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and he whispered in a voice that chilled them to the bone, "Welcome to the last stop. Your souls are now mine." The train screeched to a halt, and the doors opened to reveal a desolate, fog-shrouded landscape. The teenagers tried to escape, but their legs wouldn't move. One by one, they were dragged into the darkness by unseen hands. The last thing they heard was the sound of the conductor's eerie laughter, echoing through the night. To this day, the teenagers were never found, and the legend of the phantom conductor continues to haunt Ravenswood. The train vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the abandoned station. In the remote wilderness of northern Canada, a lone train carried supplies to the isolated towns scattered across the vast, snow-covered landscape. The journey was long and arduous, with the train often passing through stretches of forest where no human had set foot in years. One bitterly cold winter night, the train's conductor, Jack, was making his usual rounds when he noticed a passenger sitting alone in the last car. This was unusual, as the train rarely carried passengers this far north. The man was dressed in an old, tattered coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He stared out the window, his breath fogging the glass. Jack approached the man and asked for his ticket, but the passenger remained silent, his eyes fixed on the dark trees outside. Irritated, Jack asked again, but still received no response. Frustrated, he decided to leave the man alone and continued on his rounds. As the night wore on, Jack couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. The passenger hadn't moved an inch, and the air in the last car was unnaturally cold. Despite the roaring heater, Jack's nerves were frayed, and he began to dread walking past that car. Hours passed, and the train finally reached its destination, a small, snow-covered town at the edge of the wilderness. Jack hurried to the last car to make sure the passenger disembarked. But when he arrived, the man was gone. Confused, Jack searched the entire train, but there was no sign of him, who looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. The next morning, Jack mentioned the strange passenger to the station master. The station master told him a chilling story. Decades ago, a man matching that description had boarded the train on a similar winter night. He was never seen again after the train reached its destination. Some say he was a fugitive, while others believe he was something far more sinister. The locals believed that the man's restless spirit still wandered the train, doomed to ride the rails for eternity. Jack realized that he had encountered the silent passenger, a ghostly figure doomed to forever search for something he had lost in life. From that day on, Jack never worked the night shift again, and the legend of the silent passenger became another dark chapter in the history of the northern wilderness. In the heart of the city, an old subway line was rumored to be haunted. The Midnight Express, as it was called, ran only once a year on a specific date, Halloween night. It was said that anyone who boarded the train would find themselves trapped in a nightmarish journey, never to return to the surface. Sarah was a skeptic, a journalist who prided herself on debunking urban legends. She decided to ride the Midnight Express to prove that the stories were nothing more than superstitious nonsense. On Halloween night, she made her way to the abandoned subway station where the train was set to appear. At exactly midnight, the old subway train rumbled into the station. Its headlights pierced the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the graffiti-covered walls. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then boarded the train, determined to see the journey through. The subway car was empty, its seats covered in a thin layer of dust. The doors closed with a hiss, and the train sped into the pitch-black tunnel. As the train raced through the underground, Sarah noticed that the walls outside the windows were covered in strange, pulsating shapes. The lights flickered and the temperature dropped, making her breath visible in the frigid air. Suddenly, the train lurched to a stop in a darkened station. The doors creaked open, revealing a platform shrouded in mist. Sarah stepped out, her footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. As she explored the station, she realized that it was not on any map she had ever seen. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was filled with a low, menacing hum. As she ventured further into the station, Sarah felt a growing sense of dread. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing like living things. She heard whispers, too soft to make out, but growing louder with each passing second. Panic set in as Sarah realized she was no longer alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, faceless, distorted beings that moved in unnatural ways. They surrounded her, their whispers turning into a deafening roar. Sarah tried to run, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to dissolve into darkness. Just as she was about to be consumed by the shadows, the train's horn blared, and she was yanked back to reality. She found herself back on the subway train, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. The train was pulling into her original station, but something was wrong. The station was deserted, its once bustling platforms now empty and covered in dust. The city outside was silent, the buildings dark and crumbling. It was as if she had stepped into a different world, a world where time had stopped, and she was the only living soul left. Sarah never returned to the surface. The Midnight Express claimed her as it had claimed so many others, trapping her in a nightmare realm from which there was no escape. And so the legend of the haunted subway line continued, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows beneath the city.